Hi, I'm Femi Oke.
And I'm Dan Ming, and you're in the stream.
Today, confronting fascism the Antifa way. In part 2 of our conversation, we'll speak to anti-fascist demonstrators and hear more about their brand of resistance. Anti-fascist action networks, also known as Antifa, represent a decentralized collective of leftist groups, which can also include anarchists, communists, and socialists. Antifa can be found at protest events around the world, rallying against racism, capitalism, neoliberal economic policies, and far-right political groups. We want to take a much deeper dive into the mentality that goes into what Antifa calls direct action movements. So joining us, we have a mix of those who study anti-fascist groups and others who actively take part in stopping what they see as fascism in society. In Hanover, New Hampshire, Mark Bray, historian and visiting scholar at Dartmouth College's Gender Research Institute. He's the author of Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook. In London, Eleanor Penny, a political journalist and editor at Longreads. She has participated in Antifa Action and now researches far-left and far-right groups. In Dallas, Texas, BABU OMOWALE. He's a co-founder of the Huey P. Newton Gun Club, and that's a coalition of different groups supporting armed self-defense as well as patrols to protect people of color. And in Bologna, Italy, Guglielmo, he is a 26-year-old Antifa activist. He's asked us not to use his last name, and that's because of the nature of his work with Antifa groups. I'm going to show our audience guests a little clip of a white nationalist called Richard Spencer. He's pretty well known in the United States, and this was him back in January at in Washington, D.C. Have a look what happened while he was being interviewed.
KKK, neo-Nazi.
Those people don't like me.
Are you
to be
like
honest.
the hipster version of the neo-Nazi movement?
It's Pepe's become kind of a symbol.
That clip sparked an entire debate about, is it okay to punch a Nazi? It sounds ridiculous, but there's some deep, deep thoughts that go into that. Mark?
Right. So the question about self-defense against white supremacy and fascism in its current form kind of got kicked off with that and carried through other kind of anti-fascist protests. And, you know, I think that what's interesting to look at this is a lot of people were very sympathetic to this punch. A lot of people realized that it was essentially a representation of the fact that we cannot see white supremacy as a difference of opinion, but as a threat to humanity that needs to be stopped through political means. And also, we cannot reduce anti-fascism to simply quote-unquote Nazi punching. As we've known and as we started to learn, anti-fascism is a broad political movement that engages in a wide variety of forms of resistance, from researching the far right to organizing popularly. And this is sort of one facet of it, but can't stand in for the whole.
Babu, would you punch a Nazi?
Actually, I would. But that is not the answer to what we're trying to deal with. Violence begat violence. So you're saying that we can use political means to get to an end, but that's not really how we feel. In this country, blacks are being persecuted, and we've seen that over 400 years since we've been in this country, that politics has not worked. So sometimes to get rid of the you have to actually pick up the gun. And that's what we believe with the Huey P. Newton Gun Club.
So we got this tweet here from Sarah, a little bit of pushback on this conversation that you two are having. She said, I entirely disagree. Violence does not have to be used, period. You only provide your opposition with more ammunition to discredit your cause. Eleanor, what do you think about that?
Well, Nazis aren't interested in discrediting the cause of equality, the cause of liberation. They are interested in resisting it physically. They are interested in taking over the reins of power, so to stamp it out with force. This, the battle against anti-fascism, sorry, the battle against fascism, that's an important distinction, is not a battle for the moral high ground, because in many ways Nazis are not interested in winning the argument. The argument amongst themselves has already been had, and so we can't mistake this for the kind of bloodless camaraderie debate that's had in the debating chambers of Parliament and of Oxford. This is very much a battle for survival. And to say that it discredits the cause, I would say to who? because in many instances, as Mark points out throughout history, actually anti-fascist action has gained a lot of sympathy in the local communities that it's trying to protect, precisely because anti-fascist action, anti-fascist organizing in many different forms, both physical resistance and sort of more prolonged community work, is the means by which those communities survive, resist the threats of extermination. I mean, I think it was Primo Levi who said, you know, when a Nazi says he wants to exterminate you, you should believe him. And I think that's a lesson we have really failed to take to heart in mistaking the outright threats of the alt-right as some kind of wordplay, as something that we can take lightly. I think that's an enormous mistake, and one which would cause my ancestors, I'm from a Jewish background, to roll in their graves.
Guillermo, you're holding up, excuse me 1 minute, Mark, let me just bring Guillermo into the conversation. We'll come right back to you. Guillermo, you're holding up a sign which is your struggle right now. Explain the sign and then tell us, would you then use violence, have you used violence to achieve your means, the ends to your means?
My sign means let's open Labak. Labak is the social center that has been evicted by the police, the anti-fascist social center in Bologna. That is my hometown, is my city, and we're going to have a mass demonstration on September 9th to have it open back with thousands of people participating. The matter of violence against fascism, if I had to, I would, but that's not the exact answer. That, like Babu was saying, that's not what we're talking about. Because democratic institutions that are based on freedom and equality should prevent fascism to be manifested, to be demonstrated into our society. So since our institutions don't do that, there are people who organize themselves to do that. And that's exactly the meaning of anti-fascism in 2017. Because, of course, if a strong fascist movement is arising in all the Western world, and especially in Europe and in the United States, there must be somebody who takes a stop against it.
Mark, what were you going to say?
Yeah, so, I mean, most people would agree that self-defense among the Jewish population of Europe, self-defense once Hitler and Mussolini were in power, was a legitimate response in the 30s and 40s. The question is that we all need to ask ourselves is, how bad does a white supremacist threat have to be before it's legitimate for marginalized communities to defend themselves? And the anti-fascist answer is that if people are under attack, they need to defend themselves before it's too late.
Give us an example of that.
Well, I mean, we can look at what happened in Greece, right? So the Golden Dawn Fascist Party was a tiny micro party leading up to the financial crisis of 2008, and then overnight exploded into the third largest party in Greece with goon squads that was murdering and attacking migrant communities and leftist and LGBTQ communities. And so the idea is that once it gets to that point, it's beyond where we should have started, right? Anti-fascists in Greece that I've spoken to said, we wish we had taken this more seriously. So part of the lesson is, if you want to prevent this kind of threat, you need to take it seriously, even when it's in its smallest form.
So, Babu, we got this tweet, and I want to read it to you. It's from a guy named Steve in the US. He said, Antifa's stance assumes that when racists don't get the reaction they want from their targets, they escalate. I can't disagree with that. Babu, do you think that that's true?
Yes, sometimes they do escalate, and the reason for that is because they're not getting the coverage either by the media or social media that they're trying to get, so they will escalate their tactics, as they did in Charlottesville, Virginia, when they were much more violent. This is probably the most violent that we've had out of a neo-Nazi or Nazi group in the last 20 to 30 years in the United States. So we see that they're escalating their tactics as far as violence is concerned.
So, Babu, what do you think then is the reaction that they wanted to get, and do you think maybe they got it in Charlottesville?
I am not sure what reaction they were trying to get. What they're trying to do is trying to keep a hold on their hierarchy in society. That's basically what they want to do. And we're using the terms Nazi, neo-Nazi, and fascism. It all has to deal with white supremacy, which is a lot older than any of these names that we're using. People of color and black men and women have been dealing with this ideology for over 400 years in this country. So there's no other people that know firsthand what fascism and Nazism is than the people of color in the United States. And it's a direct link to white supremacy and the ideological thought.
Mark, let's break down some of the tactics. In fact, let's do that all together, guess. I want to show you something here. This is a rally against hate in Berkeley, California. Obviously made news because of the tensions there and some of the beatings as well. Antifa beat down apparent alt-writer. I'm quoting here, this is not my phraseology. And then here, Antifa pushed into MLK Park in Berkeley, where the alt-right had a planned rally. People shouting thank you to hundreds of black-clad Antifa. What is this strategy? What's this strategy right here that we're seeing? Mark.
Right. So certainly the black bloc is one of the street tactics that some anti-fascists use, not all. It originated in the autonomous movement of Germany in the 1980s and has spread around the world in different kinds of anarchist and autonomous politics. Certainly, in the case of Berkeley, anti-fascists in the United States have been concerned about any kind of presence of far-right demonstrators in any kind of public sense, and so they showed up ready for any kind of conflict that may arise. And then there was a group of agitators that were there. I wasn't there myself, but I know that if you see the press conference from the counter-protest organizers the next day, they were very thankful for anti-fascists being there, and were very thankful that the potential presence of the far right was not allowed to materialize.
So speaking of street tactics, we got this video comment, and Guglielmo, I want to pose it to you. Take a listen to Mike in New York City.
I've been doing anti-fascist work for 6 years, which, as any anti-fascist can tell you, is mostly what folks would call nonviolent. Whether it's flyering a neighborhood or calling an event venue, I've come up against the same excuses. Incredulity that Nazis exist, belief that ignoring them will make them disappear, or a general disinterest in opposing fascism. I think it's frankly disingenuous that these same people who have to this point put no work into opposing or even acknowledging the rise of fascism are suddenly speaking authoritatively on the proper way to counter.
So Guglielmo, can you tell us about the Antifa tactics that are different from the violent confrontations that we might see in the news? What else is done?
Well, for sure, there is a lot of creation of projects, a lot of organization, and a lot of cultural heritage and cultural bringing up of what we believe that is democratic, what we believe that is anti-fascist, and what we believe that is anti-capitalist too. Because what fascism and capitalism do is oppressing the men against men. And what we do in 99% of our time is creating the conditions for fascism not to exist anymore. That's what Labat did back when we had the social center, and that's why we're struggling for it. That's what we do every time.
How do you do that? Are you talking to kids at school? How do you create conditions where fascists don't exist anymore?
Well, we open spaces, and we open spaces where culture, anti-fascist culture can arise, and anti-fascist culture can live up to the point where fascists cannot be accepted anymore in our society. This is one of the means. There are many means through which all your anti-fascist organization or organization that declare themselves anti-fascist do, and I don't think there is any kind of way, any kind of tactic that should not be accepted according to what fascism is doing right now. Because otherwise, if you say that violence it should not be accepted in itself, you're basically putting their fascist violence and the anti-fascist violence on the same level, which is the biggest mistake that you could do. Because if anti-fascists are fighting physically against fascism, they're doing for a better purpose. They're doing for the higher purpose, for the purpose of freedom, the purpose of equality. And it cannot be accepted that fascism and anti-fascist physical action and physical violence could be put on the same level.
Babu, the Huey P. Newton Gun Club, if you were to break down for our international audience, what is it that you're trying to achieve? What would you tell them?
Yeah, well, the gun club was organized because black men, women, and children were being murdered around the country in the United States. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to organize patrols. So when these police went into our communities, that we were able to have an eye on these people. We would be able to see hands-on what was taking place in our neighborhoods. Our gun club is an armed paramilitary gun club. And when the police come into our communities, we're out there watching what they do with weapons. So we've got a lot of bad responses from governmental agencies and things of that nature, but that's basically what we do. We're a all black armed militia, And our intent is to better our situation in our communities by keeping a direct eye on the fascist, what we deem as the fascist police departments in the United States.
What's the biggest criticism that you've had?
Because of some of the language that we've used and some of the rhetoric that we've used, there have been.
For example, can you share some of it with us?
Well, we've said things like we'll creep up on you in the dark. Some of the rhetoric that we've been used, people have actually used this rhetoric and went out and done some of the things that we've acclimated that we said we would do.
So you tell the police we are going to creep up on you in the dark?
I mean, when you're facing a genocide in a country like the United States, where white supremacy runs rampant, sometimes you have to use very strong language and a defensive posture for people to understand that you're serious about what you're talking about.
Right. So you hurt our community, we will come for you.
Basically, that is the language that we use.
So I'd like to bring Mark back into the conversation. We got this tweet here from Moths. He said, white supremacist assembling is an act of violence and the police won't protect us. So Mark, speaking of police, do you think that the whole institution should be written off like this?
Yes. Essentially, we can see that not only in terms of the origins of the police in the United States growing out of Southern slave patrols and the desire to prevent labor organizing, we can see in the history of fascism and Nazism that the police have not come down on the side of anti-fascism. In fact, in many circumstances, they have been the most eager to accept the quote-unquote return to law and order promise of fascism. We can see, for example, in France with the Front National, in Greece with the Golden Dawn, police have been documented as voting for the fascist parties in a much greater percentage than the rest of society. And we can see, those of us who have been involved in politics, that they hate leftists more than they hate fascists. The FBI has documented extensive white supremacist infiltration into local American law enforcement. So there's really a litany of reasons why we cannot trust them to protect us or trust anyone to protect us. Communities need to defend themselves, just as our guest from the Huey P. Newton Gun Club said earlier.
This is quite a hard concept for, I suspect, a lot of people watching. Ban the police, take the police out of the equation. Eleanor?
I think the things that have been picked up on so far are telling of a very important point here, is that which we can't just ignore it and expect it to go away, because it's already deeply imbricated in our culture and our political life. When we talk about fascism, when we talk about Nazis, it's easy to think that that movement is just the people in chinos and white shirts marching on Charlottesville. Actually, the politics has been gathering force in the political mainstream for years now, and we only need to look back 50, 60 years, and you have, in America, for instance, members of Congress, mayors, members of the police who were in the KKK. This is not an isolated cultural problem. And going back on what Guillermo was saying, when we're talking about fighting fascism in a more comprehensive way, not just reacting to its street presence in a knee-jerk, defensive manner, but actually trying to build a society in which fascism is impossible, we need to be very cautious that we don't treat it as a cultural problem, because it's also an economic problem. In times of economic crisis, fascist ideas appeal to many more people because they promise dignity, they promise a sense of, they promise a living wage, they promise a sense of pride that responds to a sense of immiseration that many people feel in economic crises. And so fighting against fascism isn't simply about rooting out fascist ideas wherever we find them. It's also about offering people a different kind of hope, about saying that all of our liberations are bound up together, and that the promises of fascism are in many ways false promises.
Let me just play a little clip. This is from President Trump. He was talking about Charlottesville. You may remember that from a couple of weeks ago, where a group of, let's say, white supremacists, neo-Nazis, met in Charlottesville, and then Antifa and protesters against them clashed. And a few days after that, this is what President Trump said. Have a listen.
Define alt-right to me. You define it. Go ahead.
Well, I'm saying,
define it for me. Come on, let's go. Define
Senator McCain defined them as the same group.
Okay, what about the alt-left that came charging at, excuse me, what about the alt-left that came charging at the, as you say, the alt-right? Do they have any semblance of guilt?
This is Senator McCain's statement.
Let me ask you this. What about the fact they came charging with clubs in their hands, swinging clubs? Do they have any problem? I think they do.
Mark, is this problematic for the Antifa groups and anti-fascist movements where you have a president of a very powerful country calling them out and critiquing them?
Well, first of all, it's important to clarify to viewers that the alt-left is not a thing. There is no alt-left. It was an attempt by Trump and the far right to create a false equivalency between anti-fascism and fascism. And unfortunately, we've seen this attempt made by authoritarian leaders, by politicians throughout history. So the question is not just what will those in power say about resistance, because those in power will always try to discredit resistance. It's about what kinds of resistance are effective, what kinds of resistance embody communities from empower communities from the bottom up. And so, you know, Trump's language is really just ridiculous, and it's not really, I think, a measure of what we should do to fight back.
But sometimes it works, right, at discrediting the movement in people's minds. We got this tweet here from Eagle Parade. I want to get you to respond to it, Guillermo. He said, "My parents think liberal equals Antifa equals terrorists." What would you say to that?
I really don't know how to answer.
How would you battle that out in public opinion?
Oh, well, I don't define myself, and I don't want to be compared to a liberal, because anti-fascism and anti-capitalism go along together, and liberalism and anti-capitalism are two different things. About terrorism, it's blatantly clear the fact that we don't do anything like being hidden. Everything that we do is in the light of the sun, and that's our biggest strength, because for building up a society that doesn't accept fascism, you need to be protagonist into your city, into your country. And what we do is actually that. And it's, of course, not opposing fascism through manners that are hidden, that are in the shadow. That's not true. That's actually not true.
Eleanor, you described a little earlier a world where it was almost a utopian world, where you stumped out all of the things that you disliked. And I just wanted to ask you, let me just finish the thought, and I may be explaining it very indelicately, but what do ordinary citizens do then if they're not willing to go out and confront people where they physically might have to do something? What do ordinary citizens do?
Well, I would be very disappointed by the idea that it's incredibly quixotic or unrealistic or utopian to expect that we can build a society in which people don't face the threat of violence simply for being a person of colour, or for being Muslim, or for being a Jew, or for being a woman, or anything like that. So I would totally reject the idea that it's utopian. For me, that is a basic demand. And I completely respect.
I don't disagree with you. I just know the reality right now in 2017.
Sure, it feels utopian, right, which says a lot.
What,
but
Eleanor?
Absolutely. Because, as I say, this anti-fascism is a whole package of tactics, of which street confrontations
and
is
we're in the last 1 minute of the show. Your thought is what?
You can get involved in fighting against the economic conditions that foster fascism, the neoliberal excesses of the current government.
Eleanor Penny, Mark Bray, BABU OMOWALE and Guillermo, thank you for being part of this show. We really appreciate it. Dan?
I'll give the last word to Toe Merce on Twitter about the Antifa approach. He says, on the street when people need protection and the police are indifferent, yes to the approach of exposing, shaming and confronting white supremacy.
Thanks, Dan. Our conversation always continues with #AJStreamOnline. See you the next time. Take care.